So as Bree mentioned, my name is Jennifer, and the spirit behind today's message is one where I want caregivers to feel acknowledged, heard, and celebrated. So with that in mind, let's get started. The first thing that I have here is trying to acknowledge different types of caregiving. You know, a lot of times people think about caregivers as being a parent taking care of a child, or perhaps an adult taking care of their parent, or it could be perhaps an adult taking care of a child or a parent who has a disability, or it could be a third party that comes in. It could be a nanny, or perhaps somebody is serving as a legal guardian that could come into play as well. But there are additional types of caregivers too. For example, it could be a scenario where it's the child taking care of the parent, or it could be a child or a parent taking care of a sibling. It could also be an adult taking care of both their children and their parents. The term for that is sandwich generation, because you're sandwiched in between the responsibilities, which could be on top of a day job outside of the home as well. And so there's a lot of things going on at the same time. It could also be a spouse taking care of a spouse, or it could be certain professions such as nurses or dentists or veterinarians or clergy. You know, people oftentimes assume that if somebody's wearing a white lab coat, that they must have everything together and everything must be perfect. And yes, as part of their job, they're meant to be strong for other people, but they're also humans and have needs of their own. So it's important to acknowledge that. With caregiving, there's something that's called compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue can happen when the physical and emotional exhaustion arises from the constant demand to be compassionate and effective in helping those who are suffering. So basically, it's you're helping others, but at the same time, if you don't fill your own cup, you have less to give to other people. And when I say that, I'm not trying to imply that you should think of yourself ahead of others or think of them ahead of you. I'm just saying that you as the caregiver are important as well. It doesn't have to be that you're important in lieu of somebody else, but you're important too. So what are some potential symptoms of compassion fatigue? One of them is the inability to express emotion. And there's a term for this that's called emotional labor. You know, it's one where on the inside, you might be feeling exhausted and perhaps you are just, drained, but on the outside, you have a smile on your face and it's everything's fine. I'm fine. You're fine. When really you're not feeling fine, but you don't want to express it because of the fact that you want to be strong for other people. But sometimes that can be at the expense of you. Also, compassion fatigue could have a symptom of seeking isolation. So people just want to be by themselves. You know, maybe it's after a long day of helping somebody or doing different things. You just want to be by yourself with a good book, or maybe your iPad, watching a TV show and not be around other people. And that's good to a certain extent, but it's also important not to isolate yourself too frequently. It could also be anger and irritability. And of course, the age-old story or example of that would be perhaps you have two spouses who are in the home, and the one has been a caregiver all day for somebody or for multiple people. And perhaps the one spouse leaves the proverbial cap off the toothpaste. And maybe the caregiver who's at their wit's end after just a crazy day is like, you left the cap off the toothpaste. Now, would that normally be a big deal? Probably not. But by projecting everything that's been going on with you, with your caregiving onto that other person, it's not surprising that something that might seem small on the outside can make you blow up on the inside, or yelling out loud, I guess. It could also be sadness or apathy. You might be thinking to yourself, if somebody says, oh, I had a bad day at school, or oh, I had a tough day at the office, you might be thinking in your mind, well, if you think that's tough, I'm doing so many things at the same time, or I'm having this emotional roller coaster that I'm experiencing. So it's easy to just feel sad and just shut down. It could also be an increased use of addiction. And people normally tend to think of addiction, for example, with substance abuse, things like that. But it could also be food. It could also be shopping, especially now that people are able to shop online. And during COVID, when people are feeling isolated and you want to just somehow interact with something positive, it's all too easy to go to a certain website of your choosing and do some shopping. But after a while, that could become an addiction. There's also the potential symptom of the reduced ability to feel sympathy. And that kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where you just, your ability to sympathize with others is not very evident because you yourself are hurting. And poor self-care is also something that's to be considered. You know, people don't put themselves on their priority list, so they basically are at the bottom of it or they fall off of it altogether. It could also be problems in personal relationships. You know, as I mentioned before about projecting things onto somebody else. So whether it's a parent with a child or perhaps a couple of spouses, or it could be an adult taking care of one of their parents. Or as I mentioned, this can happen for people in the workplace. If you're working in an office or some kind of a setting, be it a hospital or a hospice care center, it might be that perhaps you're being short with your colleagues, or maybe you're feeling short with the vendors who you work with, or just the patients and their caregivers who are coming in. And that can stem from compassion fatigue. And then I also have noted here that it's possible to feel guilt. You know, people will oftentimes think, oh, I should want to take care of my spouse because I took those vows or I made those vows at the wedding. Or someone might think, well, I'm a daughter or I'm a son or I have kids, you know, and so I should want to help my parents or help my kids. And it's true that it's important to help people, but you also have to cut yourself some slack and know that you're human and that you have needs as well. What are some potential causes of compassion fatigue? You know, one of them is that perhaps the recipient's expectations are too high. I know right away my mind goes to a story from a number of years ago where a friend of mine was taking care of his dad. And the dad, unfortunately, was homebound. He had some addiction issues that he was fighting, and he was also older. And the dad, basically feeling like his life was out of control, sought a sense of control. So he would try to control the son, who was his caregiver. So one day in particular, the dad said to the son, okay, I want you to go shopping for me, and I want a certain cut of meat, and I want a certain type of rice for dinner, but they're at 2 different stores. So basically, after you've worked all day, I want you to go on rush hour traffic to the different stores, get the things that I want to eat, and then come cook them for me. So the son thought, okay, you know what? I want to help where I can, so I'm going to do this. So after in rush hour traffic, doing the shopping, going to the house, making the meal for his dad, he presents the plate to his dad, to which his dad responded, I'm not hungry anymore. You took too long. I mean, that's controlling. And so, of course, the son, as the caregiver, felt horrible. He was like, why did I just spin my wheels, you know, for the last few hours and didn't feel appreciated. Well, then he had to remind himself that with his dad, it was the addiction talking. But in another scenario, it could be perhaps that it's an illness speaking, so to speak. Someone might feel so fatigued, whether it's through radiation treatments they've done or a series of tests they've experienced, that it could just become too much. And then their expectations could be very high of you. Of course, you can also flip the script, and you as the caregiver could have high expectations. You might want to be very driven and have, say, for example, a to-do list where on a given day you want to cross things off that list and get things done. But as you're doing those items, maybe one thing is taking longer than you anticipated, or something else just isn't quite working out the way that you thought it would. And so now you're not getting through your list, and now you're disappointed that you weren't as efficient as you thought you would be. Well, again, it's you know, you're human, and it's just important to remember that even though you had good intentions of doing certain things, it's also important not to have expectations that are just too high and that don't fluctuate. Another potential cause of compassion fatigue is the perception of third parties or perhaps experiencing different cultures. So with third parties, oftentimes this could happen through social media. You know, there are people who will go out to different people's social media profiles and assume that because everybody else's pictures look perfect, that their life must be perfect. When in reality, most people probably aren't going to take a picture when they're fighting with their spouse or if they're stressed out running errands, you know, for somebody else as a caregiver. Those aren't going to be the pictures on the profile. It's going to be the trip pictures or things that are all positive. And so it's easy to wonder, well, what's someone thinking when they see my profile? You know, are they having this perception of me that because I'm not able to go on vacations and do a lot of recreational things, that maybe I'm lazy or maybe that I'm just not that ambitious? When really it might be a matter of, as a caregiver, your plate's just too full. So sometimes the perception of third parties isn't always ideal. And then with different cultures, an example that comes to mind is a number of years ago, I knew someone who worked at a nursing home, and one of her residents just kind of was hard to read. He was very, very gruff and kind of old school, kind of like assume everything's fine unless I tell you differently, kind of a mindset. But she didn't know if that was really what the issue was with him, or if it was a matter of being a reflection of her. So she would go out of her way to try to make him smile. I mean, she would crush his pills, put them in jelly so he didn't have to taste them. She would fluff his pillow and put it behind his head. She would put a pillow under his feet. You really go above and beyond to try to meet his wants. And he still never said thank you, didn't really even smile at her. So she just couldn't read him. Well, one day, both of his adult daughters came into the nursing home. And so she approached them and said, okay, I need you to level set with me here. I've been doing all these different things for your dad, and it seems like it's never enough. Am I doing something wrong? Well, imagine her surprise when the daughters began to laugh. And they said, don't take it personally. It is not you. It's our dad. Apparently, he was raised in a European country, and this is years ago, where basically people were pretty stoic. I mean, it was exactly that mindset of assume things are fine unless I tell you differently. So his reaction to her wasn't a reflection of her. It could have been any nurse crushing his pills where he wouldn't have said thank you. So it was great to get that context from the daughters and know that, it wasn't her. Another potential cause of compassion fatigue is repetition. It might be that somebody is asking you to do something day after day, or perhaps you feel as though you have to do certain things even without them asking. But that repetition after a while can weigh on you and just kind of zap you of your energy. But of course, some people will say, we'll just ask for help. And I agree with that. But it's also oftentimes really easy to think to yourself, you know what? It'll take me longer to explain this to somebody. I'd rather just do it myself. It'll be quicker. And it's true, it could be quicker, but point being, you're still gonna have all those items on your to-do list. So whether it's somebody offering to help, give them a chance, or you yourself initiating the conversation and saying, I need some help here. Could you please do this for me? And it goes a long way. Another issue with potential compassion fatigue is that you might not know the love language of the person that you're taking care of. So there's a book by Gary Chapman that's about the 5 love languages. And he writes about them in a way not to say that one love language is better than another. It's simply to acknowledge that yours could be different from the other person. So the different languages are words of affirmation, touch, material gifts, acts of service, and quality time. So an example of this is, say for example, there's a parent who works all the time. Maybe they travel for work, or they're just always at the office, but they're always gone. And they think, okay, well, I'm going to show my child that I love him because I'm going to buy him a brand new bike. So they bring a brand new bike home. It's super nice. And the son looks at it and is like, okay, well, thanks. And then the parent is wondering, well, what happened? Why aren't you more excited about this than this? And the child might say, well, you wouldn't have to give me a bike. I would rather just spend time with you. If their love language is time. Now, if their love language is material gifts, you're going to score a home run with that bike. But it's just really important to ask people, hey, what's your love language? That way it can be honored. And hopefully they will honor yours as well. Another potential cause of compassion fatigue is that a recipient may choose or not be able to say thank you. And when I say choose, it could be a conscious choice or it could be a subconscious choice. And maybe you don't know what you don't know. An example of this is when I was in college, I lived in the dorms my freshman year. And about 3 weeks into the school year, I remember I called my mom and I said, Mom, I owe you a huge thank you. And she said, well, what? And I said, my sock and underwear drawer right now is empty. And I said, I just now had this epiphany that somebody has to work to pay for the undergarments. Then they have to shop for them. Then when they're dirty, you've got to wash them and then dry them. And then they get folded and put in the drawer. And it wasn't until I saw that my drawer was empty that, oh yeah, I guess there are some things that take place behind the scenes. So now don't get me wrong, my brother and I did have chores to do when we were in high school. So that's not an issue. But at least with this, it was a good example of all the things that happen behind the scenes that I didn't have the presence of mind in high school to say thank you for. So, the well-deserved accolades aren't always there. And then when I mention the inability to say thank you, perhaps the caregiver is taking care of someone who is either medicated and perhaps sedated and can't say anything, or perhaps they have dementia and don't have the ability to maybe interact with you cognitively. And so saying thank you just isn't always an option. But that being said, I want you to know, at least by watching and hearing this message, that what you're doing is appreciated. It's just the person, may or may not be able to say thank you or have the presence of mind to do it. Also, when you have a job that's outside your home, at the end of the workday, it's possible to clock out and head home and relax. But if your role as a caregiver is at home, there is no punching out. I mean, it could be a 12-hour job during the day. It could be in the middle of the night. It could be on the weekends. It could be on holidays. It could be any time. So there's no way to go between the duties you have and being able to go home and relax if those things are taking place in the home. So that, again, can cause some stress. And then also, it's worth noting that people don't always validate your sacrifice. Again, going back to the nursing home example, this happens quite a bit when one sibling lives out of state and the other sibling lives in state with the aging parent. And the sibling who lives out of state might say things like, oh yeah, well, I assume that mom or dad are fine because they sound fine on the phone and everything's great. Where as the caregiver, well, yeah, they seem fine because I'm doing a lot of work behind the scenes. And that doesn't always get validated. So it's just important to know, even if somebody doesn't validate it, at least on the inside, know that for yourself, what I'm doing is making a difference and it's important. And then also this last point here goes back to the emotional labor again, about not being able to be strong on the inside, but you have to show it on the outside. And there's that dichotomy that really can weigh on people. So what are some ways that caregivers can support each other? The first example is resisting isolation. If you can simply go to a support group, perhaps through Gilda's Club, some kind of an event like that where people can support each other, it's great, because it's one thing for a third party to perhaps have empathy or sympathy for what you're going through, but it's another to actually have somebody relate to it. So if you could perhaps connect with somebody who is maybe working with somebody who is going through cancer, or perhaps the person is a cancer survivor, but they're still kind of unsure about what's going on. It's important to talk to people who can relate to what you're saying and say, okay, have you thought about this? How do you feel about that? And just to share ideas and feel supported. Also, it's important to reflect on certain things rather than fear what may lie ahead. And an example of that is in 2016, I had the surprising diagnosis of a brain tumor. And my brain tumor wasn't cancerous, but it was located on the outside of my brain between the optic nerve and the carotid artery. So, not the best spot. But because of the ominous spot, the surgeon was able to remove half of it, but the remaining half got radiation. And I remember that I had to have radiation done 5 days a week for 6 weeks. And so I initially thought, oh, wow, I have to have radiation in my head 30 times. I mean, it just seemed really daunting at first. So one of the tricks that I did to help myself feel better is I had a calendar. And every time I had radiation, I would cross off that day on the calendar. And rather than fearing the weeks that lie ahead by thinking, oh man, I've got 15 days ahead of me, I would instead look backwards and think, wow, look how far I've come. I'm halfway done. I know that actually on my 15th day of radiation, so at the halfway point, I purposely wore a cute dress and fun shoes because I wanted to celebrate my own way, that not so much that I had 2 weeks ahead of me, but 2 weeks behind me. It's also important to encourage each other to count blessings. And blessings can literally be hidden in plain sight. I know there were times that I had to go to the hospital to have functional MRIs. So I was in an MRI machine for quite a while, sometimes about an hour. And, it's not necessarily a place you would choose to be normally, but it was something that I needed. And so rather than look negatively at the appointments, whether it was that or the radiation, I would try to think to myself, well, you know what? I'm grateful that I get to go do this, because if I lived someplace else, that might not be the case if the technology didn't exist there, or if the people to help me weren't there. So it's really important to try to look for the glasses being half full. And there's a term that psychologists and psychiatrists use called, I'm going to sneeze here, excuse me. It's basically something where it's called neuroplasticity. And with neuroplasticity, if you try to look at things positively, initially it can take some effort, but after a while that effort becomes a habit, and that habit just becomes a mindset. And so it's really important to try to view the glass as half full when you can, both as a patient and as a caregiver. Also, it's important to do what's called cognitive reframing. And if you can reframe your perspective, it makes a huge difference. So again, circling back to the MRI sessions that I had, people had warned me ahead of time that the MRI enclosure around my body might feel kind of like I'm buried alive, or that I'm claustrophobic, even if I'm not usually claustrophobic. And so I thought to myself ahead of time, okay, I can't not experience this. I've got to figure out the how. So I was thankfully able to reframe it by pretending that the MRI machine was a tanning booth. Because back in high school, when I didn't know any better, of course, now I know that tanning booths aren't good for you. But back then I would think to myself, hey, if I'm going to in a tanning booth, I'm getting a base tan for going to prom or going on vacation. You know, the enclosure around you is a positive thing when you choose to be there. So if you can pretend that whether it's a chemotherapy session or perhaps a radiation treatment or an MRI, if you can tend to try to look at it a little bit differently by even pretending it's something different, that can make a difference as well. So an additional way to help is initiating a random act of kindness. And oftentimes people think that with random acts of kindness, it's only the recipient who benefits, when really the person who initiates the act can benefit as well. The cupcakes you see here in this picture that have the word hope on them are the ones that my family and I brought to the hospital on my last day of radiation. And the thought was that we wanted to hand them out to the radiology team, to other patients who are waiting to have their own radiation or chemotherapy done. And we did it with the mindset of, you know what, there are no guarantees in life. Even though my radiation sessions were done, I don't know that I'm done for the rest of my life. I just don't know. But at least I have hope. You know, there's hope when you can know that you're in good hands. So as a caregiver, when we can do nice things for each other, or as patients as well, you can benefit along with the person who is the recipient, which in this case was with cupcakes. Also, acts can serve as a distraction. And so I know for me personally, by handing out the cupcakes, it took the focus off of me, and it made me feel good for doing something nice for them. And another example of that is on an annual basis, I have to have an MRI done to make sure that there's no regrowth with the tumor that's in my head. And I never know from year to year what kind of news I'm going to get. So what I've done the last couple of years is I'll get a thank you card, and it's just blank, and I'll bring it with me to the hospital. And as I'm in the waiting room, waiting to meet with my nurse practitioner of my neurosurgeon's office to give me the news of the MRI, I'll sit there and write out a thank you card to her. And it takes the focus off of me. And so I might write something to the effect of, you know, I don't know if today you're giving me good or bad news, but either way, I'm glad that it's coming from you. You know, thank you for doing what you do. And it makes you feel good. So whether it's doing something nice for someone or expressing gratitude, you can actually reduce your stress hormones. You can reduce what's called cortisol. And by doing something nice for somebody, you can also do what's called influence your reward center of your brain and those feel-good chemicals in your head, your dopamine, your serotonin, your endorphins, the feel-good chemicals. So acts of kindness go a long way, as does gratitude. It's also good to note that quality and quantity are two different things. So even though we can't control the quantity of our lives, we can still influence the quality of them. And whether that's a caregiver or a patient, that's important to keep in mind. So in reference to additional ways to help you as an individual caregiver, what are some things that you can do? As I mentioned before, ask for help, even though sometimes it's not really an ideal thing to do. Take the initiative, just get it out there. You'd be surprised how many people want to help you. You could also do things such as express yourself through visual or performance art. So you could take a painting class, or you could take dance lessons. You know, art is known to reduce anxiety and depression, depending on what it is and how it resonates with the individual. So it's pretty important to keep that in mind. Also, as I mentioned before, resist the temptation of isolation. You know, get out there, whether it's a support group or a mentor program or a one-on-one situation, but try not to be by yourself a lot. And also, as I alluded to earlier, with the reduction of the stress hormones and the influencing of the neurochemicals that are your feel-good chemicals in your head, there are things even beyond gratitude and acts of kindness that can help you. So it could be a matter of listening to music that's relevant to you. If there's music that reminds you of good memories or thoughts or stories from college or high school or what have you, make a list on your smartphone of upbeat music that can make you take your mind off what you're doing and put a spring in your step. I've literally talked to people before who purposely will wear earbuds and have a song list on their phone as they're vacuuming their house, or as they're, you know, doing different things for somebody else. So music, as long as it has meaning for you, can make a huge difference in your experience. And as I mentioned too, you know, laughter goes a long way. Laughter is something that you could either do by watching a movie. It could be calling a friend from, again, high school or different scenarios and talk about old stories. I know also on smartphones, you could go to Pandora, and instead of picking a kind of music to listen to, you could listen to a comedian. So pick the comedian of your choice. You know, laughter just can make you feel a lot better. And then also pets. I mean, not everybody's a pet person. I understand that, but for people who are into pets, they can be very soothing. As a matter of fact, there are VA hospitals around the country that have pets for people with PTSD. Again, lowering stress hormones, increasing the feel-good chemicals. There are also nursing homes who have pets for people to help them not feel lonely. And then there are also, and this is amazing, there are also courthouses in Michigan, California, Montana, other places as well, where volunteers will bring their pets to a courthouse. That way, little kids who have to testify on a witness stand are more apt to actually testify because they'll have the dog on their lap, or they're petting a rabbit or whatever pet it is on their lap. But again, those stress hormones are coming down because they're actually able to do that. So there are things in life that are either free or low cost that can help make a difference in whatever it is that you're experiencing. The key is just to be open to them. Now, as a third party, people will oftentimes ask, well, how can I best help a caregiver who I know is going through a tough time? And the first thing that I recommend to people is don't just offer to help, ask how. You know, just kind of the general, oh yeah, let me know if I can do anything for you. Okay, well, that's nice, but what you're asking is going to go a lot further, and people will know that you're serious if you say, how can I help? And then the person has the option of answering you, and then you know what to do. It also could be a matter of helping with a secondary activity. So perhaps you could, rather than taking the caregiver to a movie, you could offer to babysit for that person or run their errands for them. That way they can go to the movie with their boyfriend or their spouse or whomever. So covering secondary activities can also go a long way. And then, as I mentioned before, learning the caregiver's love language is a really, really important thing to do. And then, of course, the random acts of kindness as well, or just listen. Oftentimes in life, it's not so much that people have to have all the answers, because we don't, but just being able to listen can go a long way. So I want to close the formal part of my presentation here with a toast to caregivers before we get into the Q&A session. And so I have brought with me this nice goblet. And so whether it's a reflection of things that you've done as a caregiver, or things you're doing, or things you're going to do, may you feel acknowledged and heard and celebrated. What you do does not go unnoticed. So thank you, caregivers.